There's a humanitarian crisis brewing in South Sudan, where some of the thousands of civilians trapped by conflict in South Sudan's Mil County have been surviving on water lilies and wild fruit. Civilians in the former Unity State have been struggling to survive since fighting broke out in 2013 between government forces and those loyal to former Vice President Riek Machar. It's been a daily struggle for civilians affected by what humanitarian groups are calling a man-made crisis. Relief agencies say they've not had access to the area for months, and villagers say they're unable to farm the land because of frequent military attacks. UN agencies say at least 100,000 people are affected. Most have no access to food or services. UN groups warn the situation is likely to worsen and could spread to other regions unless the world takes immediate measures now to address that famine. And to help us make some sense of the dire situation right now in South Sudan, we are joined on Skype by VOA East Africa correspondent Jill Craig, who is currently in Nairobi, and right here in Washington by John Tanza, host of VOA's South Sudan in Focus from our English to Africa division. I thank you both for joining us, but John Tanza, I want to talk to you first. The sad tragedy about this whole thing is that this is a crisis that was created by political leaders.
Yes, and it has its roots to 2013 when President Kiir disagreed with his deputy, that's Dr. Riek Machar, and fighting flared up in Juba. And there was some semblance of a peace agreement signed in August 2015, but then the agreement did not hold. In July 2016, there was heavy fighting in Juba. Machar fled the capital. And then there was an arrangement with
so
President.
This fighting has continued since 2013, and it really is severely affecting the people of South Sudan.
It is severely affecting the people because aid agencies are not able to reach remote parts. And at some point, the two warring parties are using food as a weapon. The government will not allow aid agencies to go to rebel-controlled areas, and then the rebels will also not allow aid agencies to pass to areas where the government is. So here is a situation where civilians are trapped in this politics.
Let's get Jill Craig's take on this. Jill, you're currently in Kenya, which I know shares a common border with South Sudan. Now, you've been talking to a number of humanitarian groups there. What kind of challenges do they face right now trying to help some of those people in those famine-stricken areas?
Sure, there's a lot of problems, as you might imagine, in the famine-stricken areas and then, of course, widespread throughout South Sudan. So the two famine-stricken areas, which are Mayandit and Mil counties in Unity State, those obviously are getting most of the attention right now because they are considered famine-stricken. Earlier this week, the UN actually had to evacuate about 26, or they say relocate, 26 aid workers from Mayandit County. They are hoping to get those folks back into the county as soon as possible, but access, as my colleague John just mentioned, access is a very, very big problem right now for a variety of reasons. Some places there are checkpoints set up or roadblocks. Sometimes there's just active fighting. Recently, an aid group had to worry about a looted warehouse in northern Jonglei State where they had food for children and also malnutrition supplies for those children. So it's, as one aid worker told me, right now in South Sudan, it's just about as bad as it can get.
John Tanza, to Jill's point, why are peacekeeping groups and some of the regional forces there having difficulty enforcing some of these humanitarian groups from being able to reach the people that need it most?
Well, the peacekeepers went into South Sudan under a different chapter. There was Chapter 5. They came under Chapter 5, Chapter 6 to keep peace. And then at some point, they were given the mandate by the UN Security Council to use force. That is Chapter 7. But again, that has not been happening.
Are they undermanned? Are there not enough UN peacekeepers there?
The UN peacekeepers there are more than like 12,000 troops on the ground, but the country is vast and the issues are complex. This is a country where everybody is armed, if you like, and the politics is militarized.
It's literally the wild, wild west right now.
Sort of. And in September last year, the UN Security Council issued a resolution 2304 to add troops to South Sudan, around 4,000 troops. But these troops have not gotten into the country. The head of the UN mission was complaining that they have issues with getting visas for additional troops to come into the country. So it's just a complicated situation.
And that's just a tip of the iceberg. Jill, you're planning to visit Lear County, I think, in a couple of weeks to do some reporting there. What are you learning about the refugee situation? Are they flooding into other areas, in other regions, into other countries? And what kind of impact is that having in that area?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So around South Sudan, people are definitely fleeing. There have been 1.5 million South Sudanese refugees that have fled South Sudan for neighboring countries. Of those neighboring countries, Uganda has taken roughly half of those, so about 700,000. And Uganda is considered to have a relatively progressive asylum process, which is what the aid agencies have told me. So when they arrive, they get ration cards at the border, they get checkups, malnutrition checkups, they get a plot of land in which they can farm. Uganda allows people to have their own businesses. It allows people to get a job, and they have free range of access in the country. So compared to some countries, Uganda is very, very progressive. However, even in a progressive country, aid workers have said more needs to be done. So last year, there was a plea for, I believe, $251 million US, a humanitarian appeal for that amount, and they only received about 40% of that. So as a result, they had to cut rations on refugees who had arrived before mid-2015. And the rationale for that is that those people have been there longer and they're probably more likely to be able to get on their feet without handouts. However, people say that this makes for a very, very difficult situation. And just the pure facts of funding are causing a big problem, as we're seeing across the world, to be honest.
John, to Jill Craig's point, what's the potential for this problem to sort of expand into countries like Uganda?
Well, the effect is now, Uganda is feeling the effect because a lot of people are leaving the country. For instance, if you take the regions in South Sudan, the people in Equatoria have been fleeing from their homes because there are reports of soldiers coming to villages in pursuit of the armed rebels, but then they just come the villages regardless of who is there. People are fleeing. And if you take the area where there are reports of famine, people from those areas could go to Ethiopia and other parts of the country because there's not been rain, people have no money to buy food, and so
it's a desperate situation, John, but what needs to happen right now in order to help those people?
Well, there needs to be some political solution to the problem.
Get rid of the guns, impose
Get rid of the
rule?
guns, keep the leaders talking, let them address the root cause of their disagreement, let them come back and implement the peace agreement, because without any peace agreement, this situation might escalate into a very worse scenario.
Right. And Jill, I'll give you the last question. Now, I understand South Sudan now represents like the #1 refugee crisis in the African continent, second only, I'm told, to Syria and Afghanistan. Do you anticipate that we're going to hear a lot more about this crisis as time goes on, and why aren't we hearing more now?
That's another great question, Bill, which I think a lot of people have been asking. Currently, I can tell you, I mean, when you think about famine, that is, it's called, sorry, I forgot the technical term, but I mean, that says the aid worker told me it's pretty much as bad as it can get. So currently we have 100,000 people in those two counties that are dealing with famine. Another county is expected, 1 million people are at risk of famine in South Sudan, and that's just the famine. That's what gets all the headlines. Now, we're not even talking about severe malnutrition rates, just widespread, also severe food insecurity, which is what about half, they've decided that about half of South Sudan's population will be severely food insecure by July of this year if actions aren't taken. So, it's just really hard, I think, for people to get their heads around how bad this must be for people on the ground. They have a collapsing economy, food prices have gone up, their agricultural production has gone down, and they're worried about conflict, including prevalent sexual violence across the country. So, it's something that I think people need to take more seriously. And I think that, several things need to happen in order for that to happen, for the country to become calmer.
Okay, Jill Craig, I appreciate your efforts to let the world know about what's going on. My thanks to Jill Craig and John Tanza.